We're going to identify the domain and range. We do this because we have many equations that we apply to real life things, but the mathematical formula doesn't always apply to everything, because a lot of the formulas we use have an all real numbers for a domain, when what we use it for, the domain has to be restricted. In this equation, we talk about freely falling bodies, and in this particular example, one that's tossed up at the beginning from the edge of a cliff, and its path follows a parabola. Well, the equation of the parabola would look like this, where it's going to go down and left forever, and it's going to go down and right forever, and the actual body, the freely falling object, is not going to go forever. So we restrict the domain. In this particular case, the x-axis is time, so we wouldn't want to have negative time, and the y-axis is the height. So if you're going to drop an object, it's going to hit the ground, and it's actually going to bounce back up. So then the equation that describes the height of the ball would be a totally new equation. So our original equation is no longer needed. So we restrict the domain for just the time that's highlighted in this picture right here. So that's one of the reasons why we need to know how to identify the domain and the range. And we're going to use interval notation. The domain is the x values, so we're going to figure out how far left and right the graph is. So we go to the far left of this picture and then the far right. With interval notation, we put the numbers from least to greatest and separate them with a comma. Then we're going to do the range, so we go the lowest y value and then the highest y value. And then when we do interval notation, we separate the numbers with a comma. And in this case, we put brackets around it. The brackets mean we include those numbers. So the domain is -2 inclusive to 3 inclusive. That means that we do include -2 and we do include 3. Now here we have a closed circle on the endpoints. All graphs are going to be where we include the number except for a few exceptions, and we'll get to those. This example is very similar. We're going to go left to right, and those numbers are included in this graph, so we put brackets around them, and then we go bottom to top. The domain is x values, and the range is y values. This one's different because that left side has an open circle, so that far left x value is not really -1. It's very close to -1, but we don't actually include the -1, we just approach it. So the far left, we put -1, comma, then the far right is 2. So we still write -1 to 2, but the 2 is inclusive and the -1 is not. We do the same thing with the y values. We go to the lowest y value for the range, and it's -3. And then we go to the highest y value, and it's 4. So the range is -3 to 4. And you have to watch out here because the -3 is a closed circle, so it'll be a bracket. So that lowest one is inclusive, and the highest one is the open circle. So the 4 is not a bracket, it's a parenthesis. So with this interval notation, we always use brackets, except for the few exceptions where we don't include that number. And one of those exceptions is the open circle, and we'll use a parenthesis instead. The far left -1 is an open circle, so we use a parenthesis. The far right 2 is not an open circle, so we use a bracket. The lowest -3 is not an open circle, so we use a bracket. And the highest 4 is an open circle, so we use a parenthesis. Here's another similar example. So we go to the far left for -5 and the far right for 2. They're both open circles, so they're both parentheses. Then the lowest is 0 and the highest is 3, and they're both open circles, so they're both parentheses. This one's a little tricky. We're going to go left to right for the domain. So that far left is -4 and the far right is 3. They're both open circles, so they're both parentheses. The range is the lowest y value is -1, and then the highest y value is 5. Now the lowest is an open circle, so it's a parenthesis, but that top part right there, the highest, is not an open circle, so it is a bracket. The next exception is infinity. You can't actually touch infinity, so you can't include it. So infinities never have brackets. You always just put a parenthesis with them. In this case, we went to the far left and got -2. And then that far right is positive infinity. The graph is touching the -2, that's why it's a bracket, and then the infinity is a parenthesis. So the lowest y value is 5, and it is touching it, so it's a bracket, and the highest y value is infinity, and those always have parentheses. Remember, interval notation is least to greatest, and the far left is -infinity for an x value. And whenever you're doing y values for the range, when you go down, it's also a -infinity. -infinity to infinity is how we write all real numbers in interval notation. When it's not an interval, if we just have a limited set of points, then we just list the domain and range. And so intervals are with brackets and parentheses. The list is just with braces. So with this domain, we're just going to list the x values. And so we do them in least to greatest order. And then the range, we just list the y values. Now with this next example, you're going to see the same thing. Just notice that I rearranged the numbers so they're least to greatest order. And when you have repeat numbers, you do not repeat them when you're listing the domain and range.